The silence before the storm. The house loomed quietly at the end of a cul-de-sac in Alva, Florida, its pastel exterior belying the tension simmering beneath its surface. Nestled among manicured lawns and pastel-colored homes, it exuded a sense of calm that betrayed the storm brewing within its walls. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, broken only by the faint hum of cicadas under the blistering August sun. Paul Hemmert, an elderly man with a voice cracked by years of worry and age, dialed 911 that morning, his trembling fingers fumbling with the buttons. His words trembled as he explained his growing concern. His son, Brian Hemmert, a retired Navy veteran, had been unresponsive for weeks. "It's not like him," Paul told the dispatcher. "We talk every week." Then he just stopped. The dispatcher's questions came swiftly. "When was the last time you spoke to him? Was he ill? Had there been any unusual behavior?" Paul's answers were tentative, fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite fit together. He'd mentioned a car accident, said he was recovering. But that was 10 weeks ago. Paul hesitated. His son, Jake, stays with him sometimes. But Jake, well, he's had his troubles. The undertone of unease in Paul's voice was hard to miss. "I'm not accusing anyone," he added quickly, "but something's not right." The Lee County Sheriff's Office dispatched 2 officers for a welfare check. As they arrived at the gated community, the pristine surroundings felt almost mocking. Yellowwood Drive was the kind of place where life moved slowly, where neighbors waved from across driveways and small-town rumors filled the gaps between barbecue invitations. When the officers knocked on the door, it wasn't Brian who answered. It was his son, Jake Hemmert, a 32-year-old with a rugged appearance that hinted at long days under the sun and longer nights under neon lights. Jake greeted them with a surprising nonchalance, leaning against the doorframe with a casualness that felt almost deliberate. "My dad's not here," he said, wiping grease-stained hands on his jeans. "He's on a hunting trip. Left about 6 weeks ago." The officers exchanged a glance. Something in Jake's demeanor didn't sit right, a little too relaxed, a little too rehearsed. But his answers were straightforward enough. He even invited them inside. The house was meticulously tidy, every surface gleaming with an unnatural precision that felt more staged than lived in. Brian's room was immaculate, with a neatly made bed and framed photographs of his Navy days adorning the walls. There were no signs of distress or struggle. Jake led them through the living room, the kitchen, and even the garage, where a gleaming Harley-Davidson sat mid-repair, its parts scattered like fragments of a half-told story. "Dad's pretty private," Jake said with a shrug, motioning toward a locked room at the far end of the house. "Keeps his guns in there." "I don't have the key." The officers nodded, making mental notes but finding no immediate cause for alarm. They left with promises to follow up, but as they drove away, the unease lingered. The house had felt too curated, too perfect. And Jake? Jake was a man with a past. Jake Hemmert was no stranger to the law, his past a mosaic of minor crimes that hinted at a man frequently skirting the edges of trouble. Before moving to Florida, he'd racked up a string of petty offenses in Arizona: burglary, intimidation, traffic violations. Nothing violent, but enough to paint a picture of someone teetering on the edge of the law. Yet here he was, in sunny Alva, seemingly trying to rebuild his life. He'd even started a TikTok channel, documenting the restoration of the Harley in the garage. His videos, though few in number, showed a man who seemed at ease with his tools and his thoughts. But to the trained eye, there was something performative about them. The smiles lingered too long, the jokes felt forced. Beneath the surface was a tension that TikTok's filters couldn't hide. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the officers reviewed their notes. Something about Jake's story didn't add up. A hunting trip with no destination mentioned. Weeks of silence from a man who regularly kept in touch with his father? And that locked room. The stillness of the house was no longer serene. It was stifling, suffocating, as though the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for the truth to emerge. Somewhere inside that house, behind the curated cleanliness and easy smiles, a secret festered. And the officers were determined to uncover it. Brian Hemmert was the kind of man whose presence filled a room not through loud words or grand gestures, but through a quiet resilience born of years of service and sacrifice. As a Navy veteran, he had navigated storms both literal and figurative, his steadfast demeanor a testament to battles fought and lessons learned. Neighbors often described him as steady and kind, always willing to lend a hand or a word of advice. But beneath his composed exterior, Brian was a father, and like many parents, he harbored deep concerns about his son. Jake Hemmert, by contrast, was a study in contradictions. He could be charming, flashing a grin that disarmed strangers, yet his restless eyes often darted, hinting at an unease he could never quite shake. At 32, he had the rugged charm of someone who had seen and lived too much too soon. His square jaw and sunburned skin spoke of hard labor, but his restless eyes betrayed an internal chaos. He wasn't a stranger to failure. A string of bad decisions and minor crimes followed him like shadows. Yet, there were glimpses of a man trying to find his footing, particularly in his most recent venture, creating TikTok videos. For Jake, TikTok wasn't just a platform, it was a lifeline, a window to a world where success seemed attainable with the right angle, the perfect clip, and a touch of luck. He had begun posting videos of himself restoring a vintage Harley Davidson, narrating each step with a mix of humor and technical know-how. "Gotta keep the old girl running," he said in one video, his smile stretched just a little too wide. The videos drew a modest following, but they were more than just content. They were Jake's way of proving to the world and perhaps to himself that he could build something lasting. Yet, the relationship between father and son had always been strained. Brian, ever pragmatic, struggled to understand Jake's need for validation through an online audience. He once caught Jake filming in the garage, frowning as his son rehearsed a line for the camera. "What are you doing?" Brian had asked, more puzzled than judgmental. Why waste time on strangers' approval? Jake's defensiveness would flare up nonetheless. "You don't get it, Dad," Jake had snapped during one argument, his voice rising. "This is how people succeed now. It's not the Navy or some 9-to-5. People make millions just by being themselves." Brian's response was always measured, yet firm. "There's nothing wrong with ambition, Jake. But real success isn't about followers, it's about character." These exchanges often ended in silence, a chasm widening between two men who couldn't quite find the language to bridge it. Jake's frustration simmered, compounded by his financial dependence on his father. Despite his online aspirations, Jake struggled to hold down steady work. Brian, while supportive, had his limits. Their arguments, though rare, were sharp and left wounds that festered beneath the surface. Behind closed doors, Jake wrestled with a toxic cocktail of envy and inadequacy. His father's stability and success, a steady house, a respected career, a reputation for integrity, stood in stark contrast to Jake's transient jobs and unfulfilled dreams. TikTok became both an escape and a battlefield, a place where Jake could momentarily forget his shortcomings or at least reframe them for an audience. One evening, Jake filmed a video in the garage. The Harley's engine roared to life, and Jake's face lit up in the glow of accomplishment. But the comments on the video were sparse, a few likes trickling in hours after it was posted. Frustrated, Jake threw down his tools. The noise startled Brian, who stepped into the garage with a furrowed brow. "Everything okay?" Brian asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "Yeah, just tired," Jake muttered, avoiding his father's gaze. But Brian lingered, his silence pressing against Jake's fraying patience. "You've got talent, Jake. But you've gotta stop chasing ghosts and start living in the real world," Brian said finally, his tone gentle but firm. That was the moment something snapped. Jake's face darkened, his jaw clenched. "The real world? Your world, you mean?" He spat. "Where nothing I do is ever good enough. Where you're always watching, judging." Brian took a step back, surprised by the venom in Jake's voice. "I'm not judging you," he replied. "I just want what's best for you." But Jake didn't hear him. The resentment that had been simmering for years boiled over, and as Brian turned to leave, Jake slammed a wrench onto the workbench with a force that echoed through the garage. That night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe but suffocates. Brian retreated to his room, and Jake stayed in the garage, staring at the Harley as if the machine might somehow hold the answers to the questions gnawing at him. What now? What next? His mind churned with a mix of anger, regret, and something darker, a seed of thought he couldn't yet name but felt growing with each passing minute. In the days that followed, the tension between father and son became palpable, a taut string stretched to its breaking point. Brian continued his routine, but his steps were slower, his expression heavier. Jake, meanwhile, poured himself into his TikTok videos with a manic energy, each post more desperate than the last to capture an audience that seemed indifferent. The fractures in their relationship deepened, manifesting in unspoken words and sidelong glances. Each man retreated further into his own world, the tension thickening the air in the house like a storm cloud ready to burst. But the house was only so big, and the storm gathering between them had nowhere to go but inward. The night air hung heavy, oppressive, and still, pressing against the walls of the house like an unseen force waiting to be unleashed. The garage light flickered faintly, casting erratic shadows over the cluttered workbench and the half-assembled Harley-Davidson that Jake had been obsessively working on. Inside the house, Brian Hemmert prepared to retreat for the night, his usual routine feeling heavier than ever. Dinner had been another silent affair. The clink of forks against plates filled the void where conversation might have been. Brian's efforts to connect with his son had been met with curt replies, Jake's mood dark and impenetrable. Brian had tried, he really had, but the unspoken tension was suffocating. There was no bridging the gulf that years of resentment and misunderstanding had carved between them. Brian lingered in the hallway, glancing toward the garage door, his hand hovering over the frame as he wrestled with whether to intervene or retreat into the solace of his room. He thought about checking on Jake, but the memory of their last argument held him back. Instead, he sighed deeply and made his way to his bedroom, the door clicking softly shut behind him. In the garage, Jake's hands trembled as he tightened a bolt on the Harley. The roar of the engine earlier had brought him fleeting satisfaction, but the hollow echo of his father's words lingered in his mind. "Stop chasing ghosts and start living in the real world." The phrase repeated itself like a taunt, growing louder with each turn of the wrench. Jake's phone buzzed on the workbench. The screen lit up with a single notification from TikTok, one solitary like on his latest video, a number that seemed to mock his efforts. Just one. He stared at the screen, his jaw tightening as frustration boiled within him. The likes, the comments, they weren't just numbers, they were validation, proof that he was worth something. But tonight, the numbers mocked him, amplifying the crushing weight of his perceived failure. He slammed the phone down, the sound reverberating through the garage. A wave of anger surged through him, irrational and consuming. Jake turned to the Harley, the project that had been his sanctuary, and kicked the wheel. The bike wobbled but held steady, an unyielding reminder of his own instability. The sound of the commotion stirred Brian. In his room, he sat up, listening intently. The muffled thuds from the garage were too familiar. Brian hesitated, torn between concern and exhaustion. Finally, he pushed himself up, deciding he couldn't ignore it. Not tonight. When Brian opened the door to the garage, he found Jake pacing like a caged animal. Tools were scattered on the floor, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of oil and frustration. "Jake," Brian began, his voice steady but cautious. "What's going on?" Jake froze mid-step, his back to his father. For a moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of the garage light. Then he turned, his face a storm of emotions: anger, hurt, desperation. "What's going on?" Jake repeated, his voice low but simmering with rage. "You always want to know what's going on, don't you? Can't just leave me alone for one night." Brian took a cautious step forward, raising his hands slightly in a gesture of peace. "I'm just trying to help," he said. "But you've got to meet me halfway, Jake. I can't keep guessing what you need." Jake's laugh was bitter, almost a snarl. "What I need? I need you to stop judging me. Stop looking at me like I'm some lost cause." Brian's expression softened, but his words remained firm. "I'm not judging you. I'm worried about you. There's a difference." The tension in the air was palpable, crackling like a live wire stretched taut between them, sparking with every unspoken word and unresolved grievance. Jake's fists clenched and unclenched at his sides as he struggled to contain the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "You don't get it, Dad," Jake finally said, his voice breaking. "I'm trying. I really am. But nothing ever works. Nothing ever works." Brian took another step closer, his tone softening. "You're not alone in this, Jake. I'm here for you, but you have to let me in." For a moment, it seemed like the storm might pass. Jake's shoulders slumped, the fight in him wavering. But then his eyes fell on his phone, still lying face down on the workbench. The mocking silence of a world that refused to see him for who he wanted to be reignited the fire in his chest. Without thinking, Jake grabbed a wrench from the workbench and hurled it across the garage. It struck the wall with a deafening clang, causing Brian to flinch. The sound echoed in the confined space, amplifying the tension tenfold. "Jake, that's enough." Brian's voice was sharper now, cutting through the haze of anger that clouded his son's mind. But Jake was beyond reason. His chest heaved as he turned to his father, his face twisted in anguish. "You don't understand. You never have," he shouted, his voice raw and ragged. Brian held his ground, his own frustration bubbling to the surface. "Then make me understand, Jake. Help me help you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Jake's breathing slowed, the intensity in his eyes dimming ever so slightly. For a fleeting moment, the gulf between them seemed bridgeable. But it was fleeting, and the night was far from over. As Brian turned to leave, Jake's voice stopped him. It wasn't anger this time, but something quieter, darker. "Maybe it'd be better if I wasn't here at all," Jake muttered, the words barely audible but heavy with implication. Brian froze, his hand on the doorframe. He turned back, his face etched with concern. "Don't say that, Jake. Don't you ever say that." But Jake didn't respond. He stood there, staring at the floor, his fists clenching and unclenching as the silence swallowed them both. That night, the storm between father and son reached its crescendo, its unresolved energy saturating the house with an oppressive, suffocating weight that neither could escape. The morning after the argument, the house on Yellowwood Drive was eerily silent. The air hung thick, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Brian Hemmert moved through the kitchen with a heavy heart, his usual routine feeling like a hollow attempt at normalcy. Jake didn't come out of the garage that morning. The faint sound of tools clattering and muffled curses seeped through the door, but there was no sign of him joining the household. Brian's worry deepened, the echoes of Jake's bitter words from the previous night replaying in his mind. "Maybe it'd be better if I wasn't here at all." The thought gnawed at Brian. He couldn't shake the image of Jake's face twisted with anger, but underneath, there had been something else, pain. He wanted to believe that things could get better, but the weight of years of tension between them seemed insurmountable. That afternoon, Brian decided to leave a note. He scribbled a few lines on a piece of paper, his handwriting steady despite the heaviness in his chest. "Jake, let's talk when you're ready. I'm here for you always. Love, Dad." He slipped the note under the garage door before heading out for his usual walk around the neighborhood. Outside, the Florida sun blazed, its heat relentless. Brian's steps were slower than usual, his gaze distant as he passed familiar faces and well-kept lawns. Neighbors waved, their smiles friendly but tinged with curiosity. Everyone knew Brian as the dependable, stoic man who kept to himself. But the unspoken truth was that the Hemmert household had become a topic of quiet speculation. "Everything okay at home, Brian?" Mrs. Caldwell asked as he passed her driveway, her tone light but probing. Brian forced a smile. "We're fine, Janet. Just a bit of tension, nothing unusual." But even as he said it, the lie tasted bitter. Back at the house, Jake stood over the note his father had left. His hands trembled as he read it, his jaw tightening. The words should have comforted him, but instead, they felt like a reminder of everything he wasn't, everything he had failed to become. "Always there for me," Jake muttered bitterly, crumpling the paper in his hand. The garage felt suffocating, the weight of the unfinished Harley and his father's expectations pressing down on him. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through TikTok aimlessly, searching for a distraction. But the comments on his latest video only added fuel to the fire. "Nice bike, but you'll never finish it," one user had written. "Just another wannabe," said another. Jake slammed the phone onto the workbench, the screen cracking under the force. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing with a mix of anger and despair. "They don't know me. None of them do. Not even him," he whispered, his voice breaking. By evening, Brian had returned, his steps heavier than when he'd left. The house was quiet, too quiet. He glanced toward the garage door, the note he'd left earlier now conspicuously missing. For a moment, hope flickered. Maybe Jake had read it. Maybe he was ready to talk. Brian knocked softly on the garage door. "Jake? You in there?" Silence. He tried again, louder this time. "Jake, let's talk. Please." But there was no response. Only the faint hum of the garage light buzzed from the other side. Inside, Jake sat slumped on the floor, his back against the workbench. His hands covered his face as he tried to block out the world. The Harley loomed over him like a monument to his failures, its gleaming chrome mocking him. He wanted to speak, to say something, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the weight pressing down on him when he barely understood it himself? The night fell heavy over Yellowwood Drive, its darkness seeping into every corner of the house. Brian sat in the living room, staring at the blank television screen, his mind racing. The silence between him and Jake felt like a chasm that neither could cross. And in the garage, Jake sat in the shadows, the note crumpled beside him, his anger and despair twisting into something darker. The police arrived at Yellowwood Drive with quiet determination. Their uniforms, dark and pressed, contrasted sharply with the pastel homes lining the cul-de-sac. This wasn't just a welfare check anymore, suspicion had taken root. Jake Hemmert was in the garage, tinkering with his Harley-Davidson. The sharp clang of metal against metal punctuated the stillness, echoing through the open garage. When he saw the officers approach, he stood, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. "Morning," he said, his voice steady but his eyes guarded. "Mr. Hemmert," one officer began, his tone neutral, "we'd like to ask you a few questions about your father." Jake nodded slowly, motioning for them to step inside. "Sure, but like I told you before, he's out of town. Hunting trip." The officers exchanged a glance, their practiced expressions giving nothing away. Inside the house, the air felt thick, almost oppressive. Jake led them through the rooms, each one immaculate, unnaturally so. When they reached the locked door at the end of the hallway, one officer paused. "What's in here?" he asked, his hand resting lightly on the doorknob. Jake hesitated, his grip tightening on the rag in his hands. "That's my dad's storage room. He keeps it locked. I don't have the key." The officer nodded, making a note in his pad. "Mind if we take a look?" Jake's jaw tightened, but he managed a strained smile. "Like I said, I don't have the key. It's his stuff, not mine." The officers didn't press further, but their expressions hardened slightly. They continued their inspection, their questions growing sharper, more specific. Jake answered each one with calculated calm, but the strain showed in the tightness of his voice, the flicker of unease in his eyes. After they left, Jake stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the door they'd closed behind them. The house felt suffocating, the walls pressing in on him. He knew it was only a matter of time. The following days brought a quiet storm to Yellowwood Drive. Patrol cars passed by more frequently, their presence understated but deliberate. Detectives began piecing together a timeline, their visits to neighbors growing more frequent. Jake's TikTok videos slowed, his once enthusiastic updates replaced by short, hollow clips. In one, he stood next to the Harley, forcing a smile as he explained his progress. "Almost done," he said, his voice strained. "Thanks for sticking with me." The comments were sparse but telling. "Something feels off," one user wrote. "Hope everything's okay." Behind the scenes, the investigation escalated. A search warrant was issued, and detectives returned to the Hemmert house. Jake was taken in for questioning under the guise of an unrelated warrant, his demeanor still guarded but cracking under the pressure. "I don't know what you're looking for," he said during one interview, his voice tight. "I told you, my dad's out hunting." The detective leaned forward, his gaze unrelenting. "We know that's not true, Jake. The financial records, the locked room, the freezer. You've got one chance to tell us the truth." Jake's facade shattered. His hands trembled as he buried his face in them, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered. "I didn't know what else to do." When the locked door was finally breached, the truth was laid bare. The freezer, hidden behind carefully stacked boxes, held the grim evidence of a man's desperation and a family's collapse. The house, once pristine, became a crime scene, its silence broken by the whispers of investigators and the flashes of crime scene cameras. Jake was charged with second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and fraud. His trial became the center of the small community's attention, a tragic tale of ambition turned sour, of a man undone by his lies and failures. And as he sat in the courtroom, his face pale and hollow, the weight of his actions bore down on him like an unrelenting tide. For Jake Hemmert, the facade was gone, and all that remained was the truth. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the quiet murmur of voices. Jake Hemmert sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. Gone was the defiant man who had stared down the investigators, in his place was someone hollowed out by guilt and the weight of what was to come. Across the room, Brian Hemmert's family sat in somber unity. His sister, Jessica, clutched a tissue, her eyes red from grief and sleepless nights. Friends and neighbors filled the gallery, their presence a quiet testament to the life Brian had lived and to the people who could never forgive Jake. The room brimmed with unspoken judgment, every gaze heavy with the same question: how could he? The prosecution presented its case with precision. Photographs of the crime scene flashed on the screen, the freezer, the blood-stained tools, the damning financial records. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of premeditation and desperation, of a man who had lost control. Jake's defense attorney argued that his client's actions were driven by mental instability, not malice. "Jake Hemmert is a man who lost his way," the attorney pleaded. "He made terrible decisions, but they were not the decisions of a cold-blooded killer." When it was Jake's turn to speak, he hesitated, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, the words falling flat in the heavy air. "I didn't mean for things to happen this way. I didn't know what else to do." Jessica's expression hardened, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. To her, Jake's apology felt as empty as the space Brian had left behind. The verdict was swift. Guilty on all counts, the judge pronounced: second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and fraudulent use of funds. Jake's sentence was 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25. His face remained impassive, but his hands trembled as they were cuffed behind his back. As he was led out of the courtroom, Jake's gaze flicked toward Jessica. She met his eyes, her expression unreadable. In that moment, there was no forgiveness, only the chasm of loss that separated them. In the days that followed, the house on Yellowwood Drive stood empty, its windows dark and its walls silent. The Harley-Davidson was sold at auction, its gleaming chrome finding a new home far from the shadows of its past. Neighbors avoided the street, their conversations tinged with unease. Jake's TikTok account, once a modest attempt to find purpose, became a morbid curiosity. Comments flooded his last video, a mix of condemnation and pity. "How could someone do this?" one user wrote. Another replied, "It's always the ones who seem normal." In his prison cell, Jake spent his days in quiet reflection. The noise of the outside world had been replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights and the echo of distant footsteps. He replayed the events of that fateful night over and over, searching for a moment where he could have turned back. One day, a letter arrived. It was from Jessica. Her words were brief but cutting: "You took more than just Dad. You took our family. I hope you find whatever redemption you're looking for, but I can't forgive you. Not now. Maybe not ever." Jake folded the letter carefully, placing it in the small drawer by his bunk. He didn't cry. There were no tears left. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like the cell walls that now defined his world. Outside, life moved on. Jessica found solace in the community Brian had left behind, channeling her grief into advocacy for victims of domestic violence. Neighbors eventually stopped whispering about the house on Yellowwood Drive. The Hemmert tragedy became a story to be told in hushed tones at dinner parties, a cautionary tale of fractured dreams and the consequences of unchecked desperation. But for Jake, time stood still. Each day in prison was a reminder of the life he had destroyed: his father's, his own, and those left behind to pick up the pieces. And as the years stretched on, he clung to the faint hope that one day, he might find the forgiveness he could never grant himself.